Okay, we are team two. Our topic is tipping and ethics, and our team consists of Norm, Rebecca, Megan, Matt, Ethan, Chad, Braden, and Joey. And your narrator is Joey today. So to give some background on our subject, approximately 3 million people in the United States rely on tips for their livelihood. To put this number in perspective, 3 million people is approximately 1% of the US population. So it's a large group of people. There's a few challenges with receiving your income in the form of tips. And that is, one, a huge inconsistency depending on things outside of your control. So if you're a server or waiter or waitress, you can't control ebbs and flows of the economy, which heavily influence tip amounts. You also can't control seasonality. So having your livelihood controlled by things that you don't have any decisions on can be a challenge for you. Also, what's come up recently is some legislation by the Trump administration that would potentially put tips earned by servers into the hands of business owners. So we believe that employees in this industry should be paid a fair wage by their employers. We also believe that the tips that they earn, in addition to their fair wage, should be paid to them as well. In other words, the server who earned the tip is entitled to that tip in addition to the fair wage that's being paid by their employer. To do this, we recommend a few things. One, tip in cash when possible. Two, at the end of your meal, if there's a mandatory service charge on your check, it's good to ask and understand where that money's going, who receives that service charge money. And lastly, ask how the tip jar is balanced. Is it evenly distributed among the staff, or is there an amount taken off the top, perhaps for management? What groups will benefit? In this case, a few: the server, business owners, consumers, and government. The server will benefit by having a more consistent wage. Instead of inconsistencies due to things outside their control, they would be paid a fair wage consistently by their employer. Additionally, the business owner would also have some benefits in terms of reduced costs. The cost reduction would come in the form of less turnover, less training, less hiring, and overall just retaining more employees for longer periods of time. The consumer would also benefit. The consumer wouldn't have to be the one to determine how much the tip should be. It kind of removes the consumer from the equation of the wages paid to the server. Also, government would benefit. There's a tremendous amount of income in this industry that goes unreported. So in this case, it would increase taxable income benefiting the government. We believe a few groups will be harmed: the employee, the business owner, and the consumer. By getting rid of tipping, we're capping employee wages. In some cases, employees that work in really high-end industries for very high-end restaurants, they generally make a wage well above the minimum wage. So in this case, it will harm them to some degree. Business owners will also be harmed. They will need to absorb the cost of the higher wages that they will pay in the cost of the goods that they sell. So instead of paying $2.13 an hour to their servers, they'll increase that wage. But to pay for that, they're going to have to increase the price of your pizza and the price of your cheeseburger. The consumer will also be harmed somewhat. So tipping is, it's not mandatory. You get to pick how much you tip. In this case, if we remove tipping altogether, there's going to be a higher price for everything that we pay. So the consumer will have, there will be no sticker shock. They'll know what the price is for things. It'll kind of remove the vague gray area of determining how much of a tip that they should provide for the service that they received. So whose rights will be exercised? The server's rights and the customer's rights. The server's rights will be exercised in that they won't have to deal with any type of pay discrimination. So what we learned in doing this paper is that attractive women generally make more than other women in tips, and women in general generally make more than men. So it would remove that type of discrimination. It would also remove some issues with sexual advances, and it would also remove issues with inconsistent tips based on ebbs and flows of the economy. Customers' rights will also be exercised. Customers won't have to determine how much their service was worth, which is already vague to begin with. They'll also be able to choose where they eat based on the food that they want to eat. They won't have to bring into equation, do we have to pay a tip at this place, or is there no tip at this place, or what's expected of me in terms of tipping at certain establishments. Whose rights will be ignored? The business owner's rights and the high-end restaurant employees' rights. So the business owners who currently pay really low wages to their servers because they're receiving tips, we're going to ignore their rights and hope that they pay an honest and fair wage. For the high-end employees, their rights will also be ignored. This is a very small percent of the 3 million people we're talking about who make a very lucrative income off tips. So we want to remove this part of the equation as well, so that all 3 million people who are included in this industry are all being paid a fair wage for the service that they provide. The moral problem from our perspective is that servers, waitresses, and waiters, they all rely on this inconsistent amount of money from customers. So is it acceptable for them to have to rely on customers to pay for their salary, basically? In addition to that, customers don't have any knowledge as to how much a waiter or waitress is being paid. Also, they usually don't understand how a tip is distributed. So it leaves the customers with this vague understanding of where their tip actually goes after they pay it. So how do they come up with the amount of money that they're going to tip? And how is that tip distributed? Is that really fair for the server to rely on? So what are the economic benefits? According to federal law, restaurants are allowed to pay servers $2.13 per hour with the expectation that the servers will make minimum wage through tips. There is a federal income tax credit that restaurants can take for all tips reported by the server in excess of $5.15 an hour. This credit gives the restaurant an incentive for encouraging their employees to report all tips. In non-tipping environments, restaurants would have to pay higher wages, higher employment taxes, but would have a larger deduction for increased wages and payroll taxes. What are the legal requirements? So like we said in the slide before, the minimum tipped wage in the state of Utah is $2.13 per hour. Now that is providing that the employee receives at least $30 in tips per month. Additionally, if the combined wages and tips do not exceed minimum wage, the employer must pay the difference. So in other words, if you're running a restaurant and your server doesn't make at least $7.25, the owner, you are on the hook to pay your server to make up that difference in income. Tips received by tipped employees belong to the employee, but if an employee makes the minimum wage, there's not an explicit requirement as to who keeps the tips. So if your employees, if employees at a restaurant, servers specifically, make greater than $7.25 an hour, it's not explicit who gets to keep that money. Is it the server? Is it the business owner? There is no law in regards to that. Lastly, employers must also pay payroll taxes. So increased wages will increase taxes. So if an employer is required to pay a fair living wage in excess of $2.13 per hour, the payroll taxes will increase as well. All right, ethical duties. The principle of personal virtues. So as a consumer, it's hard to say that the current state of tipping in the United States is open, honest, and truthful. So when leaving a tip in a restaurant, it's difficult to know exactly how that tip is going to be dealt with and distributed. Will the server receive the full amount? Will it be split amongst the staff? Will it be given to charity? Or in perhaps soon, will the Trump administration require that it pays the business owner these tips? Religious injunctions. Tipping as is currently constructed does not build a sense of community, but rather can put consumers and those serving them at odds. Service interactions can go from events which should be pleasant and enjoyable and it can turn it into a competition between servers against the consumer's perceived notions. The current arrangement is further damaging to the community because it places consumers in a position where they control the livelihood of their server. Ultimately, community is further broken by tipping, as there are more consumers who will not patronize an establishment if they know that they will be required to tip. Utilitarian benefits. To some degree, tipping can actually cause more harm than good. First, it harms consumers who are left with an obligation and duty to directly support the livelihood of those serving them. It's also harmful to those who work in the service industry, as they have no clear guarantees on their pay. It's reliant upon someone else. And even when excelling in their role and delivering exceptional service, they're at the mercy of a consumer to reward them accordingly. Additionally, the current culture of tipping in the United States is not the norm worldwide. So service workers, especially those in tourist areas, could be unfairly penalized by serving those who do not come from a culture of tipping. Universal duties. So us, as a body of consumers, it's difficult to say that everyone would like to have their wages be unguaranteed and based on the judgment of others, at least as it is laid out in the current state of tipping. The fair, just, and right thing would be for restaurants and other establishments to pay their employees a living wage. In this context, tipping could still exist to award exceptional service, but would not be required. A fair living wage for service workers would likely mean increased prices in terms of cost of goods sold. But under universal duties, consumers should be willing to pay these higher, transparent prices if it means that service workers are afforded the same type of earnings as themselves. So in other words, if the consumer knows they're not going to be required to pay a tip, that it's not mandatory, they will be willing to pay a higher sticker price for the goods that they're purchasing. Distributive justice. So like we talked about before, tipping isn't always transparent. It could also be argued that tipping does not promote self-respect, as tips are not solely based on servers' performance, but it's also based on the judgment and perception of the consumer. So a server could do an outstanding job and not be compensated fairly, and perhaps they'd attribute this to a lack of performance, and it would reduce their self-respect, which would actually be a misconception. Conversely, consumers' self-respect can be on the line when they receive poor service, but still choose to tip out of the sense of obligation rather than following their best judgment. And lastly, contributive justice. Tipping, while in theory is voluntary, it does not represent true freedom of choice. Consumers, with the knowledge that tips directly equate to a means of living for service workers, are obligated to pay tips regardless of the service level they receive. Additionally, tipping, as presently constituted, does not allow for servers to truly contribute or rely on their unique qualifications and skills, because tips are expected regardless of the service given. So once again, in other words, what we're saying is the consumer is obligated to pay a tip. They feel this obligation. So despite a server delivering great service or delivering mediocre service, the tip, generally speaking, can be the same, regardless of that level of service. So in closing, we believe that employees in this industry, whether it be a server, a waiter, or a waitress, should be paid a fair wage that's not reliant upon a consumer to judge the level of service that they've provided. So we just like to leave you with this thought, this quote by Thomas Carlyle: "A fair day's wages for a fair day's work." Thank you so much.